Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Sword and the Stone from 1963. Now, you may remember, if you watch this show regularly, that last week when I watched... it's probably not a good sign that I can't remember off the top of my head what the name of that movie was, The Black Cauldron. I realized partway through that movie that I was mistakenly conflating that movie with this movie. As I mentioned in that video, the era of VHSs and Disney's releasing of their movies to home video in various forms brought a lot of pre-roll ads that they would do for their other movie releases, and I'm sure that The Black Cauldron was one of them at some point, but The Sword and the Stone is the one that I was actually mistakenly remembering from ages long past that would show up, but I had never seen before. And so I figured it was only appropriate, especially after talking about The Secret of Nim and in contrast to The Black Cauldron, that I actually go and watch The Sword and the Stone. And right off the bat, I'm going to say this is a vastly superior movie, and definitely, well, I don't want to say definitely. If it was one that I had watched as a kid, it would probably have been up there on my list of favorites. This is a really strong entry, and probably one that I think is a little underrated or under-recognized in Disney's catalog. It's not without its recognition, and weirdly, it is probably one of the ones I have seen most pervasively referenced in other Disney media, in particular Fantasia and also Kingdom Hearts, draw heavily from this movie, and yet I feel like it is on the list of everybody's favorite Disney movies. It's pretty low. It's I think it's fairly common not to have seen this one, even for people who watched a lot more Disney than I did. And I think that's a shame, because I think this is a really strong entry. Even around other movies that came out from Disney near and about this time, things like 101 Dalmatians and a few others, this was surprisingly strong. It's strong in a whole lot of different ways too, and it did make me have to go back, especially after talking the last 2 weeks about animation quality. It did make me have to go back and skim through a couple of my Disney and non-Disney animated movie library from my childhood, just to go, okay, how much favorable memory am I giving to this that is not true to reality? How much is nostalgia painting the quality of the animation? And in some ways, I am wrong. I was wrong, and in some ways, I think I'm still quite right. Now, I definitely remember from this era, from the sort of 50s and 60s era, which I think is referred to as the golden age of Disney. I might be mistaken on that. There is definitely always an element of sketchiness to the animations. There is always sketch lines that are visible. The animation style is much more focused on movement and clear shapes and those sorts of things, as opposed especially to a lot of more modern animation in general, but especially Japanese animation, which tends to have much harder lines and much clearer outlines and much more, a bit less focus on movement and a bit more focus on visual clarity. And and this is not, I don't want to paint with too broad of brushes about American versus Japanese animation or Disney versus any other company, US or other, or international. But I think that's not an unfair general purpose assessment. American animation has had a lot more of a motion focus, and retains a level of sketchiness that I remembered a little bit from some of my my childhood movies, but not as much as has really come to be apparent. That said, while that memory of maybe some of those animations looked a little, rougher around the edges, that I properly remembered, the motion is still incredibly strong, and that is a key element of so many different storytelling facets and settings and tones. Contrasting it side by side with the Black Cauldron, the Black Cauldron also has a ton of animation movement in it, stuff that people spent a lot of time on, and arguably has a lot more and probably more technically capable, I would say, movement in its animation. However, the animation in this movie has so much more character. The willingness to stretch and squish and do unreal animations and just strange movements that speak far more to the nature of a character, what they're capable of, what their personality is like, rather than just trying to put lots of natural movement in. Those are really important things, and especially when it comes to characters of various ages and shapes and sizes, that adds so much storytelling and so much character information. Whether it's the way a wizened old man walks, or somebody who's very large and carries a lot of weight, or a young skinny little kid who's barely anything but skin and bones, and the different ways you animate those characters inform so much about them in general without having to say anything. Even just, especially for child characters, I think it's really important to show like the lack of understanding of their own bodies in a way. The only way I can describe this is if you've worked with kids before, or you have little cousins or whatever, that like you realize after a while, like, observing kids, you see how they don't know how their bodies move yet. They're still like sort of learning what their limbs do, and at various ages they move in different ways. And capturing that in animation is super important towards being like, oh yeah, Arthur, our main character, is an 11 or 12-year-old boy. He's still like this flaily little guy who doesn't really know what he's doing. He's like very awkward. And he's being told to do all these awkward things by adults who just like treat him like a kind of an adult, and he doesn't really like know how to move his body, and that's so important towards the physical storytelling of who he is, and that adds so much to his personality. Again, this is true of like all of the different characters in this film. In contrast, I don't think I can say that of really much of what's going on in the Black Cauldron. It's animation capable, but it doesn't say anything with its animation. The animation is more there to convey everything else that's being said, not to really do any lifting of its own. And that really keyed me into thinking about like all these other movies from the era in much the same way that, well, there's a lot of movies from this era versus more modern stuff that lose a certain element of whimsy and fancifulness, and end up being like too realistic or whatever, and being kind of dull by comparison. And that is really one of the things that this particular era of Disney in particular does so strongly, is being able to convey character through animation. And I think that carries into things like Secret of Nim and other companies, other movies, things that would spin off from Disney in after this era. That those animation styles and the people who established those styles would go off to do their own thing. So even as Disney sort of went into decline in a sense, those styles would continue on. One of the comparisons that's very personal to me that I also made was to Rocky and Bullwinkle, which I have a very soft spot for. And I haven't looked up what kind of connections there are between the animation studios. I don't think Rocky and Bullwinkle was Disney related or Buena Vista related at all. But maybe there's some cross-pollination of the animators who were there or the directorship. But that did also remind me in a larger sense as well that the necessity of the absurdity of animation, right? Especially for a kid's film, to be able to show serious things in ways that are fantastical enough to take some of the impact out of them. I was thinking about this in particular in one scene of particularly sort of mortal peril that exists in this film, and especially after watching The Black Cauldron, I was thinking about like some of the things that people talk about watching movies as a kid and going, oh yeah, that scene was really scary. And sometimes all the difference in the world is in the animation style, because I was watching this scene going, okay, this music's kind of scary, this character seems to be in real danger, but the colors and the lighting are set such that it's not completely, supposed to be, it's clearly not tonally supposed to be completely terrifying. And also the sort of ridiculousness of the animation, the stretchiness of the characters, the unreal physics and movement that are going on lend you to immediately sort of believe that or understand that like something really bad could happen, but maybe somebody will stretch and squish and get out of it and it'll all be okay in the end. And it immediately takes some of the tension out of the scene, and I mean that in a positive way. It's you could see, there can be a moment in this scene where it looks like it's all over and then suddenly it isn't, because of the sort of slapstickiness of the animation, for want of a better phrase. And that goes throughout this entire movie as well, not just that particular scene. And throughout all of, I think, the movies I can think of from Disney in this era, is this, as I was saying at the beginning, the willingness to have these sort of over-the-top movements and physics that add a level of levity and a level of childishness and wonder and fantastical stuff to it that make it more appropriate, way more appropriate for kids, where you can introduce kids to a genuinely kind of concerning, dangerous situation where the stakes seem lower, where you don't have to worry. You don't have to have the true fear, because you have an understanding that the movie doesn't want to. Doesn't want to kill anybody right now. It's just like it wants to show you tension without making you truly fear for anyone, and that goes a long way towards making something palatable for a younger audience. And I think that's super important, especially after talking about all these things that are kind of came out in the later eras and weren't super appropriate for kids. I also think this pointed out again to me some of the strength in a lot of Disney in particular, but American animation in general's use of animalistic characters. You already have these characters, these human characters who are very sort of absurd in their proportions and their movements, and representative of sort of a variety of human shape and ability. But even more so, the really smart use of animals and animal transformation and animal characters to again add a level of fantasy and a level of childish wonder to everything, so that you can sort of show funny experiences that are like appropriately fanciful for a kid. I don't really know how to say that particularly better. It's a really strong way of letting you have a lot of animation and storytelling variability without having to change scenarios too much, or even necessarily explain yourself. When you're working with a fantastical setting, you can just say, oh, now we're fish, now we're birds, now we're whatever. And that goes into, it goes back into movies that came out before and movies that would come out later, and Disney's general very common use of animal characters of various forms, sometimes like well into the animal side of things like the Fox and the Hound and the Aristocats, rather, two very different things, versus something like Robin Hood or something like that, where it's a little bit more anthropomorphic. But again, giving those like fantastical, fanciful elements for kids to work with. And again, it feeds back into letting you have animation variety, where it's one thing to stretch and squish a human character. It's another when you're working with animal characters who, like, you want to portray maybe a real world animal's behavior. So you're already sort of doing absurd things with a character that you couldn't do with a human, but also that you give them a level of, there's always a level of mystery, even to the most common of animals, of like how they behave, what they do, and what they're capable of. And I think especially for kids that works super well. And so this movie, again, like, captures so many different facets of what you can do with the medium, as well as having a way stronger capability in so many other technical levels. I think that the soundtrack for this is really strong. It's not quite as memorable, certainly for me, as some of the songs and things from this is a musical in the similar vein to a lot of Disney's animated films. Some of most of the songs I don't think are particularly as strong as some of the other entries in their catalog from the era, but still work really well and are perfect for the scenes that they are in, which I think is better than I can say for some of the other things we've watched. Likewise, I think the voice casting is very good. I was worried. I was wondering a little bit about the main character, Arthur's voicing, because as much as the voice casting is very good, and this is an era where they're still working on the technology and the capability for voice capture and dubbing, and so there's always a bit more variability in recordings than there is in more modern eras, where we have better controls and better recording capabilities and things like that. But I was wondering about Arthur. Turns out he's actually voiced by 3 different kids throughout the film. It's not that noticeable to me. It only like stuck out once or twice, maybe, that the voice seemed a bit different and off. But like, even with that problem, I still think all 3 actors captured the same kind of the same kind of character. So it's not that glaring an issue. And especially for a kid where, a young kid's voice can go in all different sorts of directions. I don't think, if I hadn't looked that up, I wouldn't have guessed that that was necessarily the case. That's just, sometimes kids have weird voices. But all the other characters are also super well voice acted, super well voice directed, in a way that some of the later stuff is, again, not. Overall, like, this is also a much more visually appealing film to me than The Black Cauldron. I think it's going for a different sort of aesthetic. This is very sort of lighthearted in general and a little less dark fantasy, and probably targeting a different age of kids as well. But I think it does everything that it does drastically better. Not just because, like, oh, I prefer this versus that. I think it's genuinely just produced vastly better in pretty much every possible way. And on top of all that, it's got a plot that's relatively basic and thin, but does exactly what it wants to do. It wants to teach it. It wants to tell a very basic story of a kid in in a less than ideal situation who's trying to make the best of his situation, and like still has sort of this whimsical feeling of being a child and uncrushed by the adulthood that is trying to be foisted upon him, which is like a sort of a positive message already. And then he goes through these like sort of fanciful events where he gets to have these interesting experiences and grow his knowledge and understanding of the world, and even be reminded of some surprisingly nuanced messages, especially for the era that this came out of, like, not everything is, it's brain over brawn. You don't have to, be the strongest guy, especially when, oh, big spoilers, the end of the film is he takes the sword and is crowned king because, like, he is worthy. He's better than the people around him who think so much of themselves. These adults or pseudo adults who have these sort of, who are not as, in a way, morally good as he is, because he has, he hasn't been tainted by the world around him in so many ways, and even when the world tries to hurt him, like, retains this sort of positive outlook and wants to be good, and that really leads towards like this whole story of the Arthurian legend. And we could delve deep into where this particular plot line comes from. It's fascinating on its own, and the history of various diverging versions of the Arthurian legends is a whole other topic that I'm probably not remotely qualified to even scratch the surface of. But I think it's a really good adaptation of, there's so many ways you could have done the Arthurian legend for kids that would have been absolutely terrible. And I think the little kid needs a little bit of guidance to get out of a bad situation and prove himself to be like, that is sort of a big difference between this movie and The Black Cauldron. I'll sort of say this as my last thought on this in general. This movie is not about getting to the end point. The end point is sort of incidental. The end point of becoming king was never his intention. It's completely incidental to, he grew as a person and learned a bunch of new things and retained the qualities that were so important to make him good, in the air quotes sense. And everything that, all of the plot elements that lead up to that are teaching him meaningful things that lead into that, but don't directly say, you want to draw the sword out, right? You want to draw the sword out, right? You want to draw the sword out, right? It's never anyone's intention, really. It's a footnote of a footnote, basically, because even the core, air quotes, core plot is sort of an afterthought. It's something that's thrown around by these secondary characters that you're sort of like, oh, that's in the background, but we're mostly ignoring it. We have the idea that it's sort of meaningful, but it's not what our main character's focus is. Meanwhile, the Black Cauldron is like so much about this quest that isn't even the main character's idea in particular. It's sort of foisted upon him in a way that doesn't feel like he has a huge amount of agency and is more reacting to his story than anything else. I think the hero's journey is not a great generally not a great framework for a kid's story. Kids don't tend to look at the world from the perspective of, I have to have great goals and long-term targets and all of these things, and I have to respond to the world and give it my best all the time. Kids tend to sort of go through life, bumbling basically, and for quite a long time until they're of probably into their teenage years. I would probably say, and so this much better captures a sort of let's say 6 to 12-year-old. I'm just kind of throwing numbers out there, like mentality of, I just want to be in the world and sort of experience it and learn things as they come up. I don't want to be lectured to. I don't understand these adult things. I'm just, experiencing the world as it is. And that goes as well to a character like Merlin being written so well to not be the like dictatorial teacher. He's more of a mentor of just sort of like letting Arthur be in situations and learn on his own. And it's a very sort of positive role model outlook kind of thing for a kid of a certain age. Meanwhile, Black Cauldron very focused on the plot, even when the main character seems to almost not want to participate a lot of the time, and it makes the whole thing feel tense in an unpleasant way. Anyway, I could keep rambling on about this movie and other movies as well, but I think that captures most of my feelings on this. I think this is a really solid entry, and again, one that I think is relatively underrated, and probably would have been one of my favorites back in the day, and maybe one I'll come back to as well. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.